The war in Ukraine is about to enter its second winter with no discernible end in sight. Apart from victory over Russia, Ukraine's other big goal is entry into the European Union. But what will Kyiv need to do to make EU membership a reality? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, in December, Ukraine will likely start formal negotiations to become an EU member. But the war-torn country brings a lot of baggage. Can it succeed?
In this envelope, dear Volodymyr, there is an important step towards EU membership. It is where your path towards Europe and the European Union begins.
A year and a half later, Ukraine's president has visited nearly every member nation, while his country takes its first steps towards membership. The EU set out 7 reforms that had to be made before negotiations could start. So far 2 have been completed, and good progress has been made on a further 4. Sources speaking to news site Politico suggest negotiations will be announced at an end-of-year summit, even if all the conditions have not yet been achieved. That would pave the way for the membership process to begin as early as 2024. But this would be a significant change to the status quo. The war has inflicted significant physical and economic damage. Looking at all the countries in continental Europe, Ukraine ranks last in terms of GDP per person. As a member of the EU, the bloc would shoulder a big part of the reconstruction costs. And then there's the question of agriculture, one of the pillars of EU policy. Earlier this year, issues around Ukrainian grain resulted in protests in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland. Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of wheat, corn, and barley. Its entry into the bloc would upset current EU producers. European Union leaders have been clear that Ukraine's place is in the EU and not outside of it. With months, even years of political wrangling ahead, what will be the compromise that would bring about an even bigger union?
Well, let's meet our guests in Kyiv. Iuliia Osmolovska, former diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and director of Globsec. In Brussels, we have Amanda Paul, senior policy analyst at the European Policy Centre. And in Birmingham, in England, Kataryna Wolczuk, professor of East European politics at the University of Birmingham and associate fellow, Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. Iuliia, I'll come to you first of all. Is this anywhere near a priority right now for people in Ukraine?
Oh, yes, definitely. It always have been a big majority of Ukrainians who had been supporting this strategic perspective for Ukraine in the contrast to more fixed feelings about NATO membership before the war in 2014. And then, since the full-scale invasion on both issues of integration into the EU and to the NATO, the public opinion shows striking stability with as high figures as 85% for joining EU and almost 80% of joining NATO. So these are quite high figures and they're quite stable.
Kataryna, if Ukraine can win this war or avoid defeat, is this what most Ukrainians truly want, you believe?
Indeed, this war is really about Ukraine remaining in the so-called grey zone. And as some people have said, those grey zones in Europe have created green light for the Kremlin. So many in Ukraine believe that both the EU and NATO membership are the key to Ukraine's security. Obviously, there are big questions what happens with the war, possibility of frozen conflict, but there is no doubt that the massive breakthrough in terms of Ukraine getting that possibility of joining the membership, something which has been on agenda of Ukraine for the last 20 years, it's not something that Ukrainian will let go very easily.
Amanda, you're in Brussels, you talk to diplomats all the time. What's the feeling like on the ground there in the corridors of power? Is this something that they really want to happen in the future?
I think overall the feeling is very positive. It's certainly a lot different to the feeling that was there prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is now in the process of actually meeting the 7 priorities that were set by the European Commission to be able to open accession negotiations with the EU, hopefully at the beginning of next year. And the progress that we've seen so far from Ukraine has been extremely positive. They've almost completely met all of these priorities. They've done the necessary reform. They've done the homework. So all going well. In a few weeks, they'll get the green light from the Commission, who will recommend that Ukraine open accession negotiations at the beginning of 2024, which would be excellent news.
Iuliia, Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has pledged to take your country into the European Union within the next 2 years. Do you think that is a realistic timescale on this?
Well, we definitely need to consider first from which starting point we are counting these 2 years. Until the war is over, it's actually would be very difficult to get into the European Union as a full-fledged member. And also we have to take into account the average duration for all the accession countries that had been joining the EU in different waves since 2000, and then average is 9 years. So definitely we are going to have a lesser period than 9 years. Ukraine is moving very fast, as Amanda said, and I only can prove that because there is a determination and political will, not of just the government, but also of the people. But we have to be realistic here.
Well, Ukrainian society certainly looks to be very united in its choice to join the European Union. According to the Centre of European Policy Analysis, 81% of Ukrainians were in favour of membership. Just 4% are against. 4% said they would find it difficult to say, and 11% offered no opinion. So they're quite striking figures, really, Iuliia, aren't they? 81% of Ukrainians completely in favour of joining.
Yes, definitely. And if you can look at different social polls and measurements, so an average figure is in between 80 and 85%. So it's quite strong support to the EU. And again, if we're talking about whether joining the EU or not, it's not just the matter of cost benefits analysis of what Ukraine will gain from the EU, but it's rather an existential choice, definitely, which had been only firming since the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine and with all these atrocities that we see. So it's definitely making choice about to which civilization you are going to belong, and actually how you would like your country to develop.
Kataryna, talk to me about the benefits of European Union membership. What would Ukraine get out of this, for example?
Ukraine would get enormous benefits. It's actually a very exclusive club for the countries coming together and creating the single market and enjoying 4 freedoms in terms of actually people being able to work and travel and set up businesses. And we know from the experience of the countries who joined 20 years ago, countries like Poland, Slovakia, for example, Latvia and Estonia, how much they've developed. They're actually now, when we look at GDP per capita, they're actually, in some cases, they are higher than, let's say, Portugal or Spain. So we've seen enormous economic, developmental, modernization benefits of being integrated into the single market, becoming a more attractive place for investment, but also better state capacity just to deliver all kinds of policies, ranging from environmental standards to water treatment and to better stop border control. So in terms of actually benefits, we also see it in the UK, that being a member of the EU does bring the benefits exceed the disadvantages.
Iuliia, you wanted to come back in there.
Yes, definitely. We have to talk about this issue about reciprocity because it's not something that Ukraine is going to benefit from the EU, but also what the EU will benefit from Ukraine. And here I can tell you that the general political stance of the government and the society actually that we want to enter the EU of not being seen as a liability, but rather as an asset and offer what we can in terms of qualified human capital, in terms of vast natural resources, in terms of very well-developed army. And for instance, if membership in the EU will happen earlier than the membership in NATO, Ukraine will definitely enforce EU in terms of military component. And if we're talking about European strategic autonomy or more visible European leg within NATO, so definitely with Ukraine's inclusion, it's going to happen.
Amanda, is that a very valid point that Iuliia makes, that, you know, this is a country and a people that have so much to offer?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's a win-win for both the EU and Ukraine. I mean, first of all, including Ukraine and also Moldova is crucial for European security. As was mentioned by, Kataryna earlier on, it was a mistake to leave this sort of buffer zone. I mean, previously the EU thought that these countries could be a buffer zone between themselves and Russia, the grey zone. This was a mistake. The integration of these countries are crucial for European security. But Ukraine is an amazing country, and it does have so much to offer. We've just heard about human capital. But in terms of the potential of Ukraine's economy, it's enormous. I mean, before this dreadful war, Ukraine was an economic powerhouse. So if we look down the line into the future, Ukraine can certainly contribute economically.
Well, let's take a look at some of the money and the figures behind all of this. How much would Ukraine joining the EU cost the other member states? According to an EU Council Secretariat paper that was leaked recently to the Financial Times in London, adding 9 countries to the EU would cost existing members more than $270 billion. Ukraine, by far the largest of the 9 countries, would be entitled to $196 billion after accession. And Ukraine would be entitled to $102 billion from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy and $64 billion from the EU's cohesion funds. Kataryna, these are astronomical figures, aren't they?
They are astronomical, and Ukraine is very big, and it may create sort of an issue. And in terms of the war, now it's the poorest country in Europe. It used to be Moldova, but because of the war and the massive hit that the Ukrainian economy has taken, now it has the lowest GDP per capita in Europe. Having said that, it is recognized that many policies of the EU, like the Common Agricultural Policy, if Ukraine is added, it would cost those massive amounts of money. However, it is widely recognized at the same time that the Common Agricultural Policy is not terribly effective. It's actually rather dysfunctional, and many regard it as a cash cow for big farm businesses, agri-businesses. So from that point of view, many people campaign for the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, and it seems Ukraine doesn't need so much subsidy. So actually, it presents itself as a splendid opportunity for the EU to take on this massive policy, which is very costly, but actually doesn't generate food security for the EU in the same way that Ukraine's membership would. So, and the same applies to structural funds. And some countries which have benefited over the last 20 years from EU regional and structural funds have said they would be happy to become net contributors if it means Ukraine could join and if the policies could be reformed. Estonia is such an example.
Iuliia, do you agree that this will be money well spent, getting your country into the European Union?
Yeah, sure. We need to do all these proper calculations, as I said, to prove that Ukraine is potentially rather an asset than a liability. But also one of the preconditions for decreasing this burden of these catastrophic figures that you just mentioned is to do a very wise assistance in reconstruction to Ukraine, because here also Ukraine derives from the fact that we would like reconstruction to happen at the expense of Ukraine taxpayers rather than the EU or American partners taxpayers. And for this, we need actually the money to allocate into Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian industries, and to help the local business actually generate this revenue and revive the economy in order to make it sustainable in some years to come. So basically, I think that we need to consider here very proper mechanisms where these assistance in reconstruction in Ukraine are channeling to, and how much there are international partnerships with our partners and companies from the EU and from America and from other countries with local counterparts. And I think that this is a very good and smart and forward-looking solution for this.
Amanda, I just wonder, are there some countries in Europe who will be hostile to Ukraine joining the club? I noticed a picture recently of Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, shaking hands with Vladimir Putin. I mean, I can't imagine Hungary are going to be hugely happy about Ukraine coming in. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, to be honest, in all accession processes, there's always countries who are more favourable than others. But I mean, this is in a way very unique situation because all member states have recognized the geopolitical imperative and moral imperative of progressing Ukraine's accession process. I mean, yes, some countries will make life difficult for different reasons, whether it's about money, whether it's about minorities, or another such incident. It's not going to be straightforward. It's not going to be quick, and it's about the journey. It will probably take Ukraine at least a decade to make it into the EU, maybe longer.
Kataryna, is there a worry that this was what sparked Putin in the first place? Ukraine, thriving, prosperous, wanting to be embraced by Europe, looking to join NATO, and that's why he invaded. I mean, if Ukraine were to win this war and get into the European Union, that would be the ultimate victory, wouldn't it?
Indeed, Ukraine was a neutral country before Russia first invaded in 2014 and had no prospect for membership, and then full scale last year. So Ukraine being in that gray zone actually didn't placate, didn't put sort of the mind of people in the Kremlin, the minds at rest. It seems now that the very existence of Ukraine is something that Russians object to. The Russian leadership objects to Ukraine being a sovereign, democratic, and independent country. And ultimately, it boils down about Ukraine's right to exist in the first place and being able to join organizations and not being invaded because of that. So it's a fundamental principle that we go back to 1945 and the end of the Second World War, how to make the European continent free of wars, occupations, rivalry, and invasions. And it seems that by this stage, it's really Ukraine's membership, and it's not only about Ukraine. We know that Moldova has changed massively as a result of Russia's attack on Ukraine, because Moldova has realized that neutrality doesn't safeguard its independence. And now Moldova is preparing very fast for enlargement, for accession as well. They want to join as soon as possible because they know that outside they are much more vulnerable, and they really depend on Ukraine's basically will to fight and capacity to fight Russia.
Iuliia, how did you feel seeing that picture of Viktor Orban with Vladimir Putin? I mean, going back to my point that there will be some perhaps in Europe who don't want Ukraine in.
Yes, they probably will. And our task is to leave these countries with less arguments against Ukraine as possible, while preparing the country from inside, being fit to join the EU. This is first. And second, it also leads to the necessity to reconsider the decision-making procedure within the EU, because the existing procedures, when you have some issues being decided with anonymity pattern. So that means that they give them the right to do this bargaining about different issues they would like to have in exchange of their yes to some of the issues. And we've seen this very clearly with the case of Hungary. But on top of that, you see that since the very first days of the war, all the decisions of the EU with regard to Ukraine had been taken with Hungary being in favor of it. So it may say a lot political stuff publicly to give this impression that they're an opposing country, but at the end of the day, they vote in those issues which require anonymity, as the other countries do.
Amanda, has the European Union ever had to deal with a country that has been through such a terrible time, such a damaging and difficult period as Ukraine?
The answer is no. I mean, obviously, the situation in the Western Balkans was difficult after the war there, but I mean, it's not comparable to what's happened to Ukraine. I mean, nobody expected the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and what Ukraine has been through, what it's going through, and what it will continue to go through to the foreseeable future is unprecedented. But equally, the support that we've seen from the EU to Ukraine is also unprecedented. I mean, it was sort of a historical moment when the EU declared Ukraine a candidate country. It's something that wouldn't have happened before. But I think it's a recognition of the fact that the EU wants to be a more impactful and relevant geopolitical player, and first and foremost, you know, in its neighbourhood. So it's had positive ramifications for the way the EU acts as a geopolitical actor, but certainly the devastating situation in Ukraine, which is still ongoing, is something that the EU has never faced before. Unless you want to talk about, you know, how the EU was founded in the first place, which was on the ashes of obviously the world wars.
Kataryna, from a Ukrainian perspective, then, what needs to happen next in terms of joining the European Union?
Ukraine needs to get ready, and this is, in a way, there is a lot of political push for Ukraine to be able to open negotiations with the EU, which are not really negotiations. They are about being told what they need to do across a number of different sectors, from basically anti-monopoly legislation to environmental standards and energy efficiency. So it's really sort of, it's really about one-way street of being informed about what membership entails, what it is about. What I would like to see, Ukraine is fighting a war, and there is no doubt that it is the utmost priority. And interactions with international partners are about basically making sure that Ukraine can fight. But at the moment, it seems that there are rather sort of shorter-term priorities. I would like to see Ukraine getting in place its negotiating team, deciding who is going to be the chief negotiating and what kind of people, what kind of structures are going to start negotiations with the EU to make it as smooth and as fast as possible.
Well, let's ask Iuliia on this. Iuliia, you are a Ukrainian diplomat. Are you ready? Do you have a team of negotiators ready to go? And look, we fully appreciate Ukraine is in a fight for its existence at the moment.
Sure, I am. I've been to at the start of negotiations on association agreement with the EU, and was in charge of coordinating the working group on political and security section of the association agreement. So I know how the process had been organized there. But I wanted to comment on what Kataryna said about this screening process and a session which are not really negotiations, but rather one-way street. On this, Ukrainian side is also quite well prepared because if we're talking about the screening of 31 chapters of different legislations of the EU, we've started this process of new kind of relationship with the EU in 2007. And since that time, we already had provisions that Ukrainian legislation had to be approximated, and most of the EU directives had to be incorporated into national legislation. We also have a provision that every bill that passed through the parliament or submitted to the parliament has to go through this assessment whether it complies with the EU norms and acquis communautaire or not. So basically, I don't see that this will be a very bulky, very clumsy, very difficult process for Ukrainian side to encompass. And I definitely know that especially the last 2 years have taught Ukrainians how to be the best proactive, very convincing and very good diplomats. You see the results.
Amanda, my final question is to you. How happy will people in Brussels and beyond be when the day finally comes that the EU flag flies in Ukrainian cities and towns and villages?
Well, personally, I'll be ecstatic when I see that. It's something that I dreamt of. And honestly, I think many people in the EU institutions will also feel ecstatic as well. It will be a great moment, and Europe should be very proud of having Ukraine as a member state.
Kataryna, just give us a prediction. How many years do you reckon it will take for Ukraine to be a fully fledged member of the European Union?
It's really tricky to say because, as we've said, it's not just about what Ukraine does, but what the EU has to do in terms of getting fit and ready for not only Ukraine's, but several other member states. The shortest period we know from the last 20 years or so was about 3 years, but Croatia, the last country to join, it took 10 years. So I think if Ukraine joins within 10 years, it's going to be a success story.
Kataryna, Amanda, Iuliia, that's all we have time for. Thank you all for your contribution. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.